Hello everyone, my name is Alec Pizzamenti, and this is my presentation on primary congenital hypothyroidism. Now, before diving into the disease, I think it's very important to understand what exactly the thyroid gland is. So the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped organ that lies in the lower neck, as you can see it in the top right of this slide. There's a nice diagram of it there. So the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. These hormones dictate the body's metabolism. Now, metabolism is exactly how fast the cells in the body are working. Now, this plays a role in how fast your heart is beating, how quickly you're breathing, in your brain development, in your growth development. All those things come down to your body's metabolism. Now, the thyroid gland also plays a role in the feedback loop. Now, this feedback loop encompasses the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus. So when the thyroid is secreting these thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, that is released into the bloodstream. Once it's in the blood, it's going to be spread all throughout the body. When it is picked up by the pituitary gland, if the levels are too low, the pituitary gland will create TSH, which will then signal for the thyroid to create more thyroid hormones. If the levels in the bloodstream are too high, then once it is picked up in the feedback loop, the pituitary gland will no longer create the thyroid stimulating hormone. So then, in return, the thyroid will no longer produce the thyroid hormones, lowering the levels in the bloodstream, maintaining homeostasis. Now for the disease. So this is a congenital disease, as it says in the name, so it's present at birth. It can lead to either partial or complete loss of function of the thyroid gland. The degree of severity has a very wide range for this disease. The symptoms are very hard to tell if they are present at all in the newborn. As many newborns do, they're going to be sleeping more, they may have difficulty feeding, and they may have constipation. The frequency of this disease is relatively low. It affects about every 1 in every 2,000 to 4,000 newborns every year. For some reason, it affects females twice as often as it does males. It is unknown why exactly this happens, but statistics show that it does. The cause of this disease, the main cause of this disease, is the lack of iodine in the mother's diet while she is pregnant with her baby. Other causes may be a sporadic mutation that would occur in the fetus as they are developing, exactly a mutation in the genes responsible for thyroid development, or it may be inherited as well. Now that would be considered a genetic cause, which takes account for about 15 to 20% of all cases. The results of this disease, if untreated, are pretty detrimental. They may cause intellectual disability, slow growth or stop growth, hearing loss, poor appetite, and breathing problems, all developmental issues. The mode of inheritance. So this disease is passed on by autosomal recessive inheritance. So what exactly that means is that if you are to be affected by this disease, you must inherit a recessive gene from your mother and a recessive gene for your father. In any other case, the gene will not affect you because it is recessive. So if you inherit a dominant gene from your father and a recessive from your mother, you'd be considered heterozygous, and you would only express the dominant gene, and the recessive gene would be suppressed. As you see in the top right here, I have a little Punnett square showing an example of this. So you have a homozygous dominant father, so he has two dominant genes, and a homozygous recessive mother, so she has both recessive genes, so she is indeed affected by the disease. If they were to have children, though, none of them would be affected by the disease, because the father is going to pass on that dominant gene to all their children. The recessive gene will also be passed on to all the children as well, but only the dominant gene will be expressed. Now, in another scenario, we have a heterozygous father, so he has a dominant gene and a recessive gene, and a heterozygous mother, who also has a dominant gene and a recessive gene. If they were to have children together, one of them would be homozygous dominant, so they would have both dominant genes. 50% of them would be heterozygous for the gene, so they would have one dominant and one recessive, also known as a carrier. So the recessive gene will not be expressed, only the dominant. And then 25% of their children would be indeed affected by the disease, because they would be homozygous recessive for the disease. So they would have both genes and have all the symptoms of the disease. So here's a pedigree example of the disease. It shows one family on the left which is affected by it, and one family on the right which is not, and they marry together. So it starts with Jack and Jill in the beginning. Jack is affected by the disease because he is autosomal recessive. He has both genes, and he marries and has children with Jill, who is heterozygous. So she has a dominant and a recessive gene. Together they have 3 children which are affected by it because they both inherit that recessive gene from both parents. From there, Mike marries Jessica, Mike is affected, so he has both recessive genes, and Jessica is nor affected nor a carrier for the disease, so she has 2 dominant genes. Now, just like in the slide before, when they have children, all of them will be carriers for the disease, so all of them will inherit a dominant gene and a recessive gene, but none of them will be affected by it. Now, in this scenario, Isabella, who is a carrier, marries another carrier, Henry. So together they have 4 children. One, which is Danny, he's homozygous dominant, so he will not be affected by disease nor be a carrier. And then they have 2 children, Philip and Roger, which will be carriers for the disease, and Daisy, which will be affected by the disease since she will inherit both recessive genes. Now, the molecular causes of this disease are caused by 3 genes. These are the 3 that can be inherited. There are many others, 10 exactly, but these are the 3 that can be inherited. So there's the PAX8 gene, which will affect the proper growth of the thyroid gland itself. And now the TSHR gene will also do the same. The last gene, DUOX2 gene, will impact the production of the thyroid hormones. Now, this is if there is a mutation in any of these genes, it would cause an improper function of the gene. An example of this is one of the proteins that it will create, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone receptor. So this protein will create these receptors that lie on the cell membrane of the cells of the thyroid gland. They are supposed to sit intracellularly and extracellularly on the surface of the cell membrane and act as a lock and key. So when the thyroid stimulating hormone comes up to it, it will lock into that receptor. and it will cause a chemical cascade to occur, as you saw with the feedback loop before. There are different ways that the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor could be wrongly formed. It could be too far into the cell, it could be not formed properly, many different ways. And this is caused by the methicillin mutation. Now, there are options for genetic testing. They're roughly about $2,000 on average. Two labs that do offer it are Eurofins and Blueprint Genetics. They run a test which tests the entire coding region for the thyroid gland, and it has 10 genes encompassed in that, as you can see here. Diagnosing this disease is pretty straightforward. It's usually done at 3 days of age, and it is mandatory across the whole United States. It is done by creating a little prick on the heel of a newborn. The blood is then put onto a piece of paper, which is sent out to a lab. The lab will then read the thyroid stimulating hormone and thyroid hormones and see if they are within normal limits. If they are not, then further testing should be done. There are 3 options there, and they may be done in conjunction with each other. One is an ultrasound of the thyroid, so having a probe held up to where the thyroid gland should be, and it will show the density of the tissue there and exactly how much of it is present. There is also a possibility of doing long bone x-rays. The purpose of this is to see if the long bones are growing at the proper rate for the development of the child. If it is not growing at the proper rate, then it will indicate that the disease is more likely present. And then there is a thyroid uptake and scan test as well. This consists of injecting the newborn with a radioactive contrast, which is not harmful for them, but is able to be recorded on how much of it is being uptaked into the thyroid and if that is within normal limits or not. Treatment is pretty straightforward once it is diagnosed. It is important to do it young though, as for a lot of development is done as soon as the baby is born. The treatment consists of supplementing thyroid hormone, which will be dictated by the doctor, and the newborn may have to come in multiple times to have blood tests ran to make sure that the thyroid hormone levels are within the right range, if more supplement is needed or less. Here are my references, and thank you for your time.